Welcome back to Abundant Culture Podcast,
where we dissect the mindsets and tactics of the true beasts of business.
People like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, and Warren Buffett.
All to create a blueprint to experience life more abundantly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to your favorite podcast. Once again, this week is all about mental health, and we got the chance to interview a psychology expert. Her name is Dr. Sunitha Chandy, and she's been doing this since 2000. So she has tons of experience with a variety of different clients. So today, although it is for entrepreneurs, this can help so many other people because we uncover loads of the psychological struggles and the nature versus nurture argument and so much more. So make sure you listen intently and take copious notes. Give it up for Dr. Sunitha Chandy. So hi, Sunitha, and thank you once again for coming onto the Abundant Culture Podcast. We are super excited to have you on because this is a topic that not only entrepreneurs need, but everybody in the world needs. And this is also what I went to school for. So this is like one of my favorite subjects. So this podcast is just going to be so much fun. But before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the podcast, can you give us a little backstory into how you got into business?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been practicing since 2007, so a lot longer than I realized. But I actually moved out to Chicago in 2009, and when I moved out here, I really wanted to do community mental health. That's what I was doing out in California. But unfortunately, when I got out here, I realized that the mental health system is really different. And so if you want to work in under-resourced neighborhoods, they don't typically hire doctorate level therapists. And so when I was working out in California, I was working at a great community mental health organization and doing really good work. When I moved out to Chicago, they wouldn't hire me because they couldn't pay what they thought was a fair salary for a doctorate level, and even taking the pay cut for a master's level clinician. I don't know how master's level clinicians really get to do this work and live a sustainable lifestyle. So I joined a group practice and just sort of worked sort of in private practice for a while, but was really passionate about figuring out how do we make community mental health work and addressing the needs of different populations, and also being able to take the reach of psychology a little further than the therapy room. So by bringing services into the community for companies and organizations. And so I started my business 2 years ago, sort of out of that vision of trying to get back to what I really love.
That's awesome.
Amazing. So can you explain to me how you got interested in psychology? Like what was the first time where you realized, oh, I have to get into psychology so I can help people in this way? Like where did that passion kind of form from?
Yeah, I think I fell into psychology sort of sideways by accident. My parents really wanted me to go to med school, become a doctor. It's very standard immigrant family. You can be an engineer, a doctor, computer science. Those were your choices. And so when I was applying to college, my dream was to study dramatic arts. I loved like playwriting and acting, but I took a psych class in high school that I thought was really cool. And so I signed up as a psychology major. And then when I started taking classes, I fell in love with it. So I have always been fascinated about why people do what they do and why do people interact the way they interact. When you think about social dynamics or influence, like how do you convince people to do things, how people work in relationships. And so psychology was the first time I realized, oh, people study this. Like you can actually learn this stuff. So at that point, I sort of found my passion. So I jumped into it and I loved it. And the more I thought about the practical application, especially coming from an immigrant community and thinking about some of those cultural dynamics of being raised in the United States, but having a family that was really culturally tied to their country of origin, and the dynamics that creates and understanding who you are, it got me really fascinated about how do we address mental health issues from that sort of cultural perspective. And so finished undergrad and decided I wanted to practically apply the skills. So that's what got me into clinical psychology. is I love the research, I love the knowledge. And then I was like, okay, well, how do you bring that to people in a practical way? And so that's how I ended up in clinical psychology.
Awesome. So what was, I guess, one of the most fascinating things that you, I guess, learned about psychology? Because there's so many, I feel like there's so many different types of psychology, and there's so many different types of people. What's that one thing that you would say would be like the most interesting thing that you've learned and kind of like to do on your day-to-day in psychology?
Oh, that's really hard. One thing, I think
Or
I
at
have
least
been,
give me something in the top 10, just one of the
yes.
top 10, because I'm pretty
Oh,
sure.
one of the top. I think group dynamics I find really fascinating, especially in our modern context. So I think the ideas of groupthink, how we can be influenced by the other people around us, and how biases can sort of explode and grow because of how we're looking at things. I find that really fascinating, right? Like it's all those experiments, like if someone's facing the wrong way in an elevator, a bunch of people who come into the elevator are also going to face the wrong way because of social norms and social dynamics. And also, when you think about groups that hate each other, like you can create two different groups by just making group A being red and group B being blue. And you can get them really competitive and you can get them to start thinking really negative things about the other group. And the dynamics of like, how do you bring groups back together? I find that really fascinating. I could go on. There's lots of different like I love social psychology and cognitive psychology. So social psychology is a lot about those interpersonal dynamics, and cognitive psychology is a lot about how we think and how our brain works, which is just really vital. And when you think about how do we affect our relationships and how we work with other people. So those are some of my favorites right now.
So basically a very I guess interpersonal politician would love to hire you.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
So,
But I think it's really interesting when you think about the business world or even families. So much of what we're doing comes out of our emotional experience, but there are ways in which we can shift how we interact to bring each other closer together or to create more divisions. And I mean, being in the role of an entrepreneur myself, I don't think I had thought about how important it was for me to carry myself in a way that builds a culture that I want. Because it's really easy to accidentally build a culture that you're not actually trying to build.
So would you say that culture of division is harder than to create a culture of like togetherness? Because that's something that I've always been really interested in, is like, you know, how easy it is for you to dislike somebody as opposed to, I guess, how easy it would be for you to find camaraderie with somebody who you may be very different from. So what was your experience with that?
Well, I think it's really interesting because our sense of self, who we are, is defined by relationships, right? Like infants don't know that they're a person or a thing except in relationship to their parents, right? So there's a process where like when you see little babies, like they can get terrified of their hands because they're like, what is this thing in front of me? But eventually they realize like there's a me and then there's the mom or the dad. And the first place that we start defining ourselves is in comparison or contrast to someone else, right? And so there's this naturally built into us reflection of the other person. And so I think it's really easy for differences to come up. We categorize the world, right? So we've got short people, we've got tall people, right? We've got people with dark hair, we've got people with light hair. But what starts to happen is we start to attribute good and bad to those distinguishing marks. So I do think it's really easy to build divisions because we naturally define ourselves by other people, right? I know that I'm not this, so therefore I am this. But I do think we forget that there is a lot of overlap. That while we're built to categorize the world, like I think it takes a different level of intentionality to look for connections, partly because that's what we want as people, right? There's this fundamental aspect that we don't exist outside of connection, right? So that same infant isn't going to develop if it doesn't have social relationships, or caregivers. And so I don't think that part of being a human changes as we get older. Our dependence on others changes, but our need to self-reflect and feel connected, that continues throughout the lifespan.
Mm.
So, okay.
Oh, I was gonna say that I feel that relates so much to entrepreneurship. Like the entrepreneur is the baby, and they have to find like the connections with everybody else just to stay afloat, like to stay an entrepreneur, and a good one at that.
Yeah, definitely. So, another thing I was kind of curious about is we were talking, I think when we were at Joe Martin's event, somebody had brought up like, you know, how stressful it can be to like be an entrepreneur, and how just like they're just so like, I wouldn't say so different, but there are probably small differences between somebody who's an entrepreneur and somebody who's really not entrepreneurial at all. And I was kind of wondering, what were some of the common, I guess, psychological tendencies or problems that you see entrepreneurs struggle with?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the big things that I've seen folks struggle with is this idea of the myth of independence. So because entrepreneurs are people who step out into something different, they often step out into things by themselves or just with one other person. There's this idea of like, well, I got to know everything. I got to be able to deal with everything and build everything and develop everything because there isn't a safety net around me. And so entrepreneurs often have to build their own safety net. They have to build their own community, but they have to do that under this myth of, I need to be able to do it by myself. Right. When I first started my business, I think the first place of insecurity I had was like, oh my gosh, everyone else knows all this stuff and I don't know it. Right. I'm just a psychologist. I don't know anything about the financial side of things, or I don't know anything about the operations and business development side of things. Well, I have to just act like I know it, or else I'm not allowed to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Right. There's almost this access of like, I can't be vulnerable and not know something. And really, in reality, most entrepreneurs I know have areas of vulnerability, right? They come in with innovation, but we have lots of room to grow. And so there's this myth of like, I need to be fully grown before I start this. And so we just try to fake it. And whenever we're trying to fake something, it inhibits us letting people in, right? If I'm trying to convince you guys, hey, I'm an expert, I'm very serious, I'm very educated, everything I say is wonderful and important, I've got to hold everyone at a distance so they don't see my vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? Because if you get too close, you see my vulnerability. But really, entrepreneurs need people who are close because we're right in front of the stuff we're trying to do. If we don't have people near us, who's going to give us perspective? So I think that there's a level of anxiety that entrepreneurs feel, or depression when things don't work, that they spend a lot of effort hiding.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really big place. Like whether we feel depressed or anxious or have other sort of mental health issues that come up, a lot of what maintains it or intensifies it is our need to hide it. Like it's not safe. I'm not supposed to share it, without realizing like whenever you take a risk, anxiety is normal, right? More pressure is normal because you're learning while you're doing. That is going to feel more difficult.
Yeah. And another thing I was kind of wondering is, where do you think that need for independence kind of comes from? Because is it something that like, oh, it's just a human being type thing? Or is it that we're taught that, oh, you need to, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and handle, whatever it is you have to handle? Or is it a little bit of both? What's your experience on that, of like the root of where that comes from?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think American culture is very, I like how you said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right?
Yeah.
We are like, I had a toothpick and a paper clip and I built a mountain, right? Like we have this idea of like the rugged, like hardship, like we're going to self-motivate. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think a lot of people hustle and they are really creative about how they use their skills. And I think there's a huge place to realize like we are all beneficiaries of the people who supported us and set us up.
Yeah.
Even people who didn't support us, we had to learn how to thrive through that. And that also built skills. So whether we learned it in a way we wish we hadn't, or we were given resources by people, we still benefit from the relationships we have. So I do think there's like a cultural myth that we do it on our own, especially Chicago, right? We're the city of
Yeah.
big shoulders, right?
Yeah.
We're going to make it happen. We're going to hustle it through. And I think there's place for that. But I also think like it's a long-term hustle. And when it's long-term, that's when we need space and we need a little rest. We need some time to recoup and get support so we can jump back in with the same passion.
Yeah. And it's so amazing that you say that, because one thing I realized is that when I first started my business, I had a few naysayers who were very close to me. Not this one, she's my partner, but other people. But other naysayers who was like, you're not going to be able to do it. You're going to suck. All of these bad things are going to happen. Right. And what was crazy about it is one day I had realized like that person short term, it like really hurt my self-esteem and hurt my feelings. But long term, that person that didn't support actually did more for my self-esteem and my self-image than some of the people who actually helped. And it was so strange in a way, because it was like, I don't know how that actually works, but like I looked back and it was almost like that was my first interaction with real resistance as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And when I overcame it, the other resistance that I would meet after that, because you're always, bumping into resistance as an entrepreneur, it became easier and easier to overcome other things after that. And I felt that if I couldn't necessarily overcome somebody saying that you can't do it, how can I overcome, wanting to do this project and not having the, money to do it? Which is probably a bigger resistance. So it's so amazing that you said, it really comes from, we benefit from the people who support and don't support at the same time.
Yeah. Well, because I think sometimes when someone doesn't support us, sometimes they have a good point. And if we really are passionate about the thing that we're trying to build, we're going to use that information to say, you know what, there is a hole in my plan, but I believe enough in this that I'm going to find a way through this hole or to fill this hole. But other times when you meet resistance, it helps build your values, right? When you still want to push against that, you got to know how and why. And so that builds muscles, that builds confidence, but it also gives you a path of like, I want to do this because of this. So I'm going to persevere through this because this is worth it. It's worth trying. Even if I do fail in the end, I'll feel better because I tried.
Yeah. And well, that point, it reminded me, we were on someone else's podcast like last week, and we were talking about like our military experience and how horrible it was and how much we disliked it, to say the kinder words. And, he kind of put two and two together, and like we kept talking about, abundance and leadership, and towards the end of the podcast, he was like, so it seems like you guys want to be better leaders because of your poor leadership in the military. So it was crazy that like we kind of like saw that reflection, like, you know what, maybe that is the reason we want to be great leaders and have like that great culture within like all of our companies, because of our terrible experience with the poor leadership that we had before. So that like that point reminded me of that like instantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I never realized it, honestly.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Okay. So we were talking about the other day, Joe and I, about like the nature versus nurture argument. So we wanted to know how much of your psychology would you consider like genetic versus trained?
Yeah, this is the fundamental debate in psychology. And we have to say the answer is always both, right? That we have a really hard time teasing apart nature versus nurture. There is actually amazing research out there now about how your environment can shape which genes turn on and which ones turn off. Wow. Right. And so it's not even just like you get given this sort of DNA code, but your ability to shape how you use it, also the environment you're born in, the situations you're in, can shape what turns on and what turns off. The thing that often comes up in the nature versus nurture argument is like, am I stuck? Right? Is this just the cards I got played? And
Good
like,
point.
you know what? I just was born without this gene. I'll never be X or Y because I didn't have it in my genetic code. Well, one thing's true. I will never be 6 foot tall because I tapped out at 5'7", and that's just not in my genetic code to be that tall.
Yeah.
Honestly, the fact that I'm this tall is actually pretty fabulous because I'm the tallest in my family. So there's a sense of like, yeah, I hit a point. But if I had grown up in an environment where there was less nutrition, I probably wouldn't be this tall. Right? When I look at my dad's family, as his family in India got more finances, his siblings got taller. So while they had the genetic code to be taller, then my dad's like, what, 5'6". Each of his brothers is significantly like an inch plus taller as they get like, as time progressed. The environment changes how those genes show up. And so, yeah, it's like we can pop out of the womb a certain way. Like I always think about emotion regulation. So some of us pop out of the womb really sensitive, right? So that means like if there's a shift in emotions, we feel it, right? Like I can tell like, oh my gosh, everyone's really sad. And someone else is like, what are you talking about? I don't notice anything. That is something that we're born with, our responsiveness to stress hormones. That doesn't mean that our environments can't change it. So then if I grow up in a high stress environment, oh man, like I might be freaking out all the time. But let's say I grow up in a really low stress environment or with parents that are equipped to teach me skills, then I may not experience a high level of stress, even though I naturally have more sensitivity because I got skills. And that can actually change how my brain is wired or how it functions. But even better, if I'm that kid who had high sensitivity, grew up in a really difficult environment, as an adult, I can still learn skills that can change how my brain is wired. Like our brains are really flexible. And so while we get dealt a certain hand of cards, it doesn't mean that there's only one way we can play it, which is what I find really fascinating and really hopeful. So part of the work that I did early on in my career, and I still do now, is I specialize in work in suicide and trauma. So specifically with children. And so when you think about that, like no one wants to hear about horrible things that happen to kids.
No.
Right? We don't want to hear that stuff. And the thing that was the most redeeming for me is to know that that trauma, while significant and impactful and will never be erased, doesn't have to hold a child back from finding ways to thrive. And I think that that's a really hopeful thing, and that they can develop skills and resources in a horrible way, but that they can use for their growth and development. So that has always been really helpful for me in my work when I hit something hard or I want to tell myself like, yeah, you just don't have the skill set to do this. I unfortunately have to be reminded of like, yeah, but I can still grow and develop.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing because it's almost like you're basically what you're trying to say is that your subconscious mind actually has the ability to automatically tap into certain genetic predispositions depending on, you know, what's going on in your environment and in your life. Mm-hmm. And that's it's so strange too, because I talked to a guy the other day, and he was I think he just finished getting his degree in psychology, and he was saying that when it came to like children who were going to be like maybe who had a risk of being in and out of jail when they got older, he said there's these like little check boxes, and he listed off
it was called ACE.
The ACEs.
Yeah. And then he listed off like the things that would make you a higher risk of being kind of like a troublemaker when you got older. And it was so strange that I had so many check boxes next to my name, like because of things I had went through when I was older. And I was like, wow, the fact that I haven't like done anything too crazy, a couple of crazy things, but nothing too crazy, was like staggering. And it made me feel great because it meant that if I could overcome some of these things, you know, other children may be able to overcome a lot of those things as well. And I just think it's amazing that you do that type of work and that you help people who, you know, may be having all these different cards against them. You help them overcome those odds. And I think that work is so important.
Yeah. I mean, like the ACEs study was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it was pretty groundbreaking research to realize that early childhood events and environmental stuff could increase the risk factor, not just for exposure to like violence or crime, but like mortality rates for young kids. And that's really scary because as a kid, you don't set up your future. I mean, you don't set up the environment you're in. Right? Yeah. You don't choose like, hey, I'm going to live in this neighborhood, not that neighborhood. Or, hey, you know, I'm going to pass on that. I'm going to pass on that trauma. I'm just going to do this instead. Like kids don't have a choice. And so it becomes really important in the like early childhood intervention work. And as adults, we have the ability to choose the environments we put ourselves in. We have the ability to set ourselves up for success. But on the flip side, when you think about kids, there's this whole great research. What you're describing, Joseph, is the positive youth development model. And so there's all these risk factors that make kids more likely to commit crimes, substance use, like teenage pregnancy. But there are also this other side of the research that look at all these developmental assets that are protective. So the more assets a kid has, the more likely they are to thrive in difficult situations. And so I always feel like it's so good to balance the two things, that you might have had some really rough risk factors. You probably also had some assets, and just having potent assets can actually help move you to a healthier place, which is why we don't just have to reduce risks. We can also build our strengths, because especially as entrepreneurs, there's only so many risks you can move. There's only so safe you can make the process. So part of it's also then, okay, if I can't make this process safer, can I get some more assets to help me thrive when I step into hard places?
Yeah. And what are those assets typically consist of? Like, can you list off a couple of those assets that you speak of that could generally help somebody just live a healthier life, you know, in all regards, whether it's, you know, business or their own health or even just their relationships?
Yeah. So when we talk about developmental assets, most of that research is done with children. And so there are two different sets of those assets. You've got internal assets. So those are qualities of the individual, and then external assets. And the neat thing about the research is actually relationships and having healthy relationships with others. So especially for like adolescents, having an adult that they look up to is a key asset. So if you have a kid in a difficult situation, but has a mentor or someone they look up to, it can make a huge difference in how they thrive. And I would actually say for entrepreneurs, mentorship is key as well. Having a community of people or people who are ahead of you in the business or in some areas of business that you're trying to grow in, having people that you can talk to and support you and give you guidance is key. I also think a lot of it is like commitment to action and commitment to self-growth can be really big, because like you said, like we know from research that if you sleep like 7 to 8 hours a night, if you get some form of exercise and you eat healthy, you will feel better. And everyone hates that advice because we want something else to make us feel better. I want to be able to sleep 4 hours a night and still feel amazing in the morning. And realizing that it's the same analogy I used at the talk with Joe Martin, is that you're not the driver, you're the car. Right. And we want to run through life like we're zooming around, speeding through things. That when we hit that pothole, it's not our car that hits it, we hit the pothole. And if we keep driving through those potholes at 70 miles per hour, eventually something's going to get loose. And if we want to accomplish our goals, we got to stop, we got to check and take care of ourselves so we can do our good work. And we don't like that. We want to be able to push through things and be fine. And I think building that model of like taking care of yourself, and I think that is both emotionally, I think it's physically, it's spiritually, and relationally. And if you can find a place where you're working on that, no one's ever perfect at it, I think we're more effective in being able to build a business that's going to work.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some ways that people can work on like themselves and all the different aspects, like the spiritually, mentally, physically, all that? like how can they improve in those areas? Do you have like any examples, like specifically?
Mm-hmm. I think if someone's just getting started, to say like, hey, do I need to work on stuff? Am I okay? Like, it's sort of like using that sort of car metaphor. It's like, when are you checking up on yourself? So I would actually say self-assessment, or just listening to your body. That's actually how I usually describe to clients what emotions are. So when people talk to therapists, they're like, okay, here we go. We're going to get really emotional. Going to start crying or yelling. Well, in some ways, emotions are just alarms. They're telling you something's going on. So if you stop for just like 5 minutes, you just say, okay, I'm going to sit and I'm just going to listen. How do I feel? How have I been feeling? And you notice like, oh, I'm feeling really sore. My back is hurting. I'm feeling tired. I'm feeling blah. Okay. What's causing those feelings? How long has that been going on? What can you do to shift and change it? Right? We don't always take the time to do that assessment. Like when a mechanic looks at your car, they're like looking under the hood. They're checking the levels. Obviously, you can tell I'm a mechanic. I know exactly what I'm talking about. They're checking something in there. They're
Yeah,
rotating
they're
my
doing something.
tires.
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's this idea of like, one, how are you checking? Like, how am I feeling about my social relationships? Am I connecting with people? Have I been getting angry a lot? What's that about? What's going on? How do I feel about that? Am I okay with it? And so I do think there's a point of like self-assessment. I would also say taking breaks is really key. If you're getting really caught up in your business, that's wonderful. Like you're trying to build something amazing, put your effort there. But I also think it's really healthy to take time to step back and do something different. One, it'll help you come to whatever you're working on fresh,
Yeah.
but it also helps you assess like what else is in the background. Sometimes a great way to avoid our emotions or feelings or other problems is to throw ourselves into work.
Yeah.
Right. And you hear a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of high executives whose marriages fall apart, right? Because they were so focused on one piece that they didn't focus on their relationships. Right. So it is the idea of like, how do you assess, like, how am I feeling about my relationships? How am I feeling about my connection to spirituality? It's asking those questions, I think, is a good starting point. If you get to a point where you're like, yeah, something feels off, right? You're like, yeah, I'm like not sleeping. And it's not even because I'm not laying in bed. My mind is whirling. Or, man, I'm not feeling like I used to. Then I would say it's a great time to talk to someone. And it doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a trusted friend or advisor. It could be a spiritual leader. But it's like, talk to someone and get an assessment. If someone else is concerned about you, then maybe it is worthwhile to take a mindfulness class, take a vacation,
Yeah.
you know, do something rejuvenating or fun that triggers joy. Those are some of the suggestions to get people started. But then if you're still concerned, like, make an appointment with someone, have them do an assessment, give you an idea of what's going on.
Yeah. And I know personally, just one, in my culture, and two, just for the sake of being like growing up in America, there's not always a positive connotation to getting professional help in the
Mm-hmm.
realm of psychology.
Yeah.
And I guess, what would you say to somebody who like they just grew up and it's like, oh, like they just like, there's something wrong and they know there's something wrong, but like admitting that there is something wrong is like, there's a blockage there, especially
Yeah.
I can say from experience, as being a guy, like I'll talk about my feelings sometimes and then it'd be like, I'm not supposed to do this, I'm a man. Like
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
like and then it just like reverses all the way back to like being this, almost blank, emotionless person that I'm really not. So how do you get those people to open up, and what would you say they should do or think about when they're looking to get help?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because I think there are a lot of communities, one, that are rightfully so distrustful of psychology or mental health, even the medical world, because even when we talked about like entrepreneurs are trying to act like they've got everything together.
Yeah.
And so if you're acting like you've got everything together, then admitting that you are weak or vulnerable or something's bothering you is countering this identity you're supposed to have. And so I would always say too, like, if you don't admit you have a problem, then you can't fix it or change it. And so there's this idea of like, it's not about not being strong enough to make it through. It's about being strong enough to face what you're going through and realize you can make it out. Because oftentimes when we hide stuff, it's the idea of like, this is too big for me, right? I can't deal with this feeling. I can't deal with the struggle because it's too big, right? And whenever we hide anything in the dark, it's always bigger, right?
Yeah.
Kids are scared of the dark. When you go into a dark room, you're like, oh my gosh, there's a monster in the corner. Nope, it's just the couch with some clothes thrown on top of it, right? And so I think there's this myth that you're going to come into therapy and people are going to just make you feel weaker and more emotional. And can I be real? Sometimes you come into therapy and it gets harder before it gets better, because the first thing that you do is you have to see that there's something going on. And then we don't just wipe it clean and make everything perfect. We jump in to what's hard so that you can build a way out, so you can build the confidence and resources that come through working through hard stuff. But I would normalize that. It's normal to be tentative, to see weakness. But I also want to say there is something really healthy about building a model of growth, right? That you're not done yet. And again, I think American culture is very much like this. Like, we are superstars now. And if we're not good enough now, then we're not good enough. And what is it like to say, hey, I'm not good enough yet, right? If you were trying out like for a sport and you're like, okay, I'm not super great at this aspect of the game. You can also tell I'm an athlete by my analogy here with my vague metaphors, but it is the idea, like, you get a coach. You get a coach, like you get a defense coach or an offense coach. They run you through drills. They have you do workouts. They have you change your diet because you're trying to build the muscle so that you can excel. The goal is eventually you're not going to need that coach. You are going to internalize all those behaviors. But if you've got a bad coach who's telling you to do stuff that is not working, and they're like, just eat cabbage. You're on a cabbage only diet. You're going to make the best free throws now. Just eat that cabbage. Eventually you're going to be like, I hate cabbage and my free throws aren't any better. Right? There's a place to say, like, be discerning. Like, if you decide to go in for help, you are in charge. You're not the vulnerable person. You're the person coming in who is strong enough to admit you need help, and you are looking for someone to walk with you in that. So I feel like a good therapist is going to be able to handle you asking your questions, you pushing back on them, you finding the right fit, because not everything works for everyone, right? Like, I don't have a one size fits all treatment for anyone. I want to see where they're coming from, what they already are bringing to the table. But sometimes the work takes a while, and sometimes it doesn't take that long. So it's really a good mix. But I do think it's hard. I think sometimes we are really protective and we don't want to see what's not working. And so again, you can't fix a problem until you recognize there's a problem. Right. And so that's always the first step.
Definitely.
So I have two questions. The first one is, how does someone know if like a therapist isn't like a good fit for them? Like, let's say they've been going for months, and they just don't know if they should see another one or if they should stick with that one. And then also, how does someone go about finding a therapist?
Perfect. Well, with a good fit, the first thing that I would say is, do you feel comfortable and trust this person? So what all the research shows us is that the relationship connection between the therapist and a client is one of the main motivators for change. So if you feel like this is someone who cares for me, they've got my back, I feel like I can trust them, good. That's a good starting point. If you're like, I don't know about this person, or I don't think they get me, I think culture plays a big role. Sometimes there's just not a great fit. You feel like, oh, I have to explain too much about who I am, or they don't have a good context of what it's like to be like me. Then yeah, that might be worthwhile to say, like, maybe I want to find someone who has more experience with different populations or groups. I would also say change is a really good measure. Like, going into therapy knowing I want to see this improve or change. So with with clients I work with and all the therapists that work with me, that's always a question we ask everyone who comes in. We always ask, what do you want to see change or get better from coming to therapy? And we ask that in our first meeting. The reason why we ask that is I want to let you know if we can get you that. Right? So if you come in and say like, I want to be 6'7" in 3 months, I'll be like, I can't help you. You want to go find a doctor who's going to give you growth hormones, but we don't do that here. Right? Or like, I want to make my spouse be nicer to me. I'll be like, okay, great. I can't change your spouse. I can help you relate to your partner better. I can help you shift the dynamics that help you feel more connected, or we can bring up those conversations. But your spouse isn't here. I can't guarantee we're going to fix that. So we want to get to know what you are looking for. But I would say ask your therapist. If you're not sure if therapy is helping, you can say like, hey, what are you thinking about how I'm doing? What's your plan? Like I said, there's lots of different therapeutic styles and treatments. So some therapists are going to be really upfront and explain everything to you. But others have a treatment plan, have a focus. They're just not walking you through it. You can always ask that, right? Like, how do you think I'm doing? What do you think I need to be working on next? I'm not sure if I'm growing as fast as I want to, or if you feel like they're moving too fast, you can be like, hey, I think I need a little more space to work on this a little slower. That's always your right to ask. And again, like a good therapist can walk you through that. They would be able to say like, hey, I think you're doing really good. And you might be like, hey, well, I don't actually feel really good. That's going to open the door to deeper therapy. Yeah. And if your therapist responds really well to that, that's going to help you feel more connected and hopefully guide you guys to better work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Next one. Yep. So another thing we were kind of wondering is, like we kind of said before, the small mental differences between somebody who's an entrepreneur and somebody who's probably would never even consider being one. One thing I've always been really curious about, because this has been a problem for me personally, is what advice would you give to a family member or maybe a friend of an entrepreneur on how to support that person in their venture? Because there's times where I want to like talk about kind of what's going on with me in regards to my companies. Like it could be something as small as like, it's not really going the way that I want it to go, but because, you're my dad and you're not an entrepreneur, it's kind of hard for me to say that. So there becomes this whole gap. It's almost like
a misunderstanding.
Yeah. It becomes like, I'm doing this thing, like you love me and you want to support me, but like, I feel like sometimes they don't know how, and sometimes we don't know how to convey those emotions. And I feel like there's this gap. I don't know if you've experienced, but when I got into entrepreneurship, there was this very noticeable gap that widened between me and my different family members. And that wasn't necessarily intentional, but it just happened. And have you seen that? And what do you usually say to either party, either the entrepreneur or the family member, on that gap and how to close it a little bit?
Yeah. And I think you see this in other dynamics outside of just entrepreneur and non-entrepreneur. You can see it with cultural differences. Yeah. You can also see it like with individuals who are going into a career that no one else has gone into, right? I come from a family of engineers. So being the psychologist is a very different sort of language. My parents, I love them. They still ask sometimes, so what do you do when you talk to people? Like there's just not,
years later,
there's not a framework for it. So I would actually say like part of it's also giving grace, like understanding that sometimes people can't understand where you are unless they've been there. Like I have no idea what it's like to be a man. I've never been a man. I don't think I ever will be a man. And so I can do my best to empathize with that or try to understand it, but I just can't. It doesn't mean that I can't have relationships with men or work with men in a supportive way. But I do think there's a place of realizing sometimes the people in your life are going to have stronger responses to things because they're concerned or the ways in which they know how to love you. And you see this too in like acculturation differences or even cultural differences or generational differences. Often like they're worried about you. Like my parents often say like, oh, you guys are so stressed. You have so much going on. You guys need to calm down. Well, part of it's also like, hey, Dad, do you remember what you were like when you were my age? Like, remember all those hours you were working on the 2 businesses you were running? I don't know if you remember that. This is a stage of life we're in now, right? Their perspective is different. So I would say, one, if you feel like your family members can't get it, it's helpful to take a step back and say, where are they able to support me? And if they're naysaying or if they're like discouraging, is it because they're worried about me? Right? So sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, you just need to find a normal job, right? Like this isn't working. You need to find something new. Or when you say something's not working out, they'll be like, you'll figure it out. It's not that big of a deal. Part of it's understanding like, well, why are they doing that? Is it a way for them to protect themselves from their anxiety? Do they not understand it so they don't know how to talk you through it? I would say one way to bridge that gap is to translate. So like if I'm going to talk about things related into psychology, I'm going to have much more fruitful conversations with my sisters who are engineers if we're talking about processes and like industrial psychology and understanding like workplace relationships, because they manage teams and they do more of that sort of like building systems. There's a way to translate. Like there are great overlaps in a lot of different sort of fields. And so that's part of what we talk about. But sitting down and talking about what it's like, they always say, oh, I couldn't do your work. I'm like, well, I couldn't be an engineer either. Like it goes both ways. So I would say like, are there parts of what you do that fit the expertise and experience of your family so that they can connect with it more? And can there be space for them not to get it? Right. So I think sometimes bridging that gap can be difficult. So I would say another great strategy is to validate, right? If they don't get it, what did they get? Right. So if you go to your dad or your uncle or your mom and you don't get the response that you are looking for, why did you go to them? You can say like, well, yeah, I just wanted to talk to you about this because of your experience in, leading our family or in your workplace. Sometimes people also say like, well, I have nothing to offer. I've never run a business. I've never done this. So they already disqualify themselves.
Yeah.
So, and there is the part that sometimes you are different and they're not going to get it. Can you focus on where you are similar to build the relationship? Is there space to tolerate that, hey, maybe they won't get this?
Yeah.
And I can just kind of be bummed by that.
Yeah. And it's so amazing that you brought up that point of translating, because I noticed that's something that maybe I'm better at it now, but in the past, I definitely was not very good at that. Like I would speak in my language and that's the framework that I went off of. And then people are like, well, what's wrong with you? And it's like, and it just never really turned out right. So like, I think that piece, like you could have charged for that. And I'm so glad.
I'll send you the bill. It'll be perfect.
Light bulb went off when I did that, because I literally thought back to a conversation where I was speaking in terms that I would understand and the other person did not receive it. They actually rejected that idea. And for me, it was so plain and simple, but for them, it was like, no. And then I was like, oh, it's because like, it was probably because we weren't necessarily in the same framework, because at least if I'm on the same playing field and you disagree, we at least get each other. But for me, I feel like that particular time, it was because we were on, 2 different levels on what we were talking about. So I think that is truly key. And it's something that I honestly did not implement that I definitely will starting from now on.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we do want to start wrapping it up. So a question that we have to ask is, what is the number one takeaway that you want people to walk away from this episode with?
Oh, you always make me pick one. I think my biggest takeaway I want people to take is that it's okay to not have it all together. Right? And recognizing you don't have it all together now creates a pathway for you to build what you want. And so I think if we spend all our time pretending we have it all together or acting like we're all together or that we can't do something, it holds us back from growing. And so if we give ourselves that space, then we can actually grow into who we want to be.
Absolutely.
And everybody remember the car analogy. Remember.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So since you're on the Abundant Culture podcast, how do you spread abundance?
Ooh, I think partly by trying to be authentic. I think more can grow out when we're open and authentic, so that I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to have everything totally set up. I can be growing. And I think when we create a space for everyone to know they have room to grow, if everyone is growing, then that just is an amazing multiplicative, that's a word, right? Abundant, we'll just use the abundant word, an abundant way of thinking, right? If we can just not have to like solidify ourselves and say like, I'm done, I'm an expert. But if we can always be in a place of growth, then we can grow some amazing things.
That's
I
amazing.
love that. And for the person that loved this episode and they know they need to talk to someone, how do they get in contact with you?
The best way to get in contact with me or anyone on my team is through our website, artesiancollaborative.com. So we have therapists here that are happy to work with people. We also do coaching and training services. But if we aren't able to get you in as a client of ours, we will help you find a therapist or a coach that can help you out.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think this was an absolutely great episode. And it was so great that we honestly didn't get to all the questions that we had. So there might need to be a part 2 one day.
Yes.
But we appreciate, the tremendous value that you gave us and our audience. And we truly appreciate that.
Yes. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys. I love spreading the word.
For sure. Thanks.
Awesome.
So that's all we have for today, folks. I hope you got as much value out of this as we did. Keep in mind, the only way we can improve is through constructive feedback. So remember to rate and review this episode. Also, you are not the only person that needs to know this super valuable information. So be sure to subscribe and share as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember to always spread abundance. Peace.